Okay, so today we're going. This is one of three-part series where we're going to be talking about the Bernanke report on the Bank of England and so on. So just to remind everybody, the Bernanke report came out last summer, and the Bank of England had promised that they were going to respond to this by the end of the year, which would have been December 2024. It is now May 1st. And I'm looking at a recent speech by Claire Lombardelli, who presented something at the Peterson Institute a couple of weeks ago on where things stand and so on. It's called a midterm assessment and so on. And one of the things that she points out, she makes a couple of points that I want to respond to and get the reaction of Martin Weale, who was a former Bank of England staffer, as well as a former member of the Monetary Policy Committee.
I was never employed at the Bank of England. I was only there as a member of the Monetary Policy Committee.
I see. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. What years were you a member of the Monetary Policy Committee?
2010 to 2016.
I see. Good. And so Martin's going to provide his perspective. I'm going to provide my perspective as someone that's developed FPASS Mark One regimes. And so I want to explain what an FPASS Mark One regime is after retiring from the IMF and helping numerous countries develop those regimes. The Central Bank of Armenia asked me to develop the FPASS Mark II regime. So I'm going to try and explain what that is and so on. So an FPASS Mark I regime, which is something we call a forward-looking monetary policy system, has three essential ingredients. The first one is, where do we think the economy is? That might sound easier than it actually is, but it's actually quite difficult for monetary policy because we have to analyze, what is the current state of the economy? Do we have excess demand or excess supply conditions in the goods market, in the labor market, and so on? What are inflation expectations? Very difficult because the measures of inflation expectations are very problematic, especially the ones based on surveys and so on. So understanding where the economy is not an easy job. The second ingredient is what are the underlying forces driving the economy? Now, I want to really, really emphasize because in the remarks that she gives, she makes a couple of, I'd say, 3 points that I want to comment on. One is that they're looking at other central bank experiences, and I think they should be looking at the best of the best central banks that have been experiencing this, which are small central banks. And I don't see any reference or learning about all those central banks that have actually been doing this really well and so on. Second point that she makes is that she seems to think about it as developing a toolkit. And there I disagree totally. I think that's what the main problem with the Bank of England is that they don't understand this is all about developing human capital, what Ben Bernanke in his review referred to as seasoned economists. And I know with pretty a large amount of certainty what he means by that is the kind of economists that you would have at the Fed, at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, which is not about just building a bunch of tools, but basically developing the human capital. And he used the term seasoned PhDs for that. I think if you look more widely at how central banking is practiced throughout the world, you'll realize you don't need PhDs. You need seasoned economists. You need central banks that realize that this isn't about some modeling or toolkit kind of exercise. It's about developing people that have good judgment about how to think about answering those first two questions. Where is the economy today? And what are the underlying forces? And lastly, which is why the Bank of England and why the ECB and why the Bank of Japan, why these advanced economies have fallen so far behind, is that they don't understand that the most important question is, what do I need to do with my instruments to achieve my objectives? And this, I want to go back all the way to the late 1980s and early 1990s when I was teaching the Bank of Canada this, which is it's not just about setting the policy rate today, that what monetary policy is about forward guidance, about providing information about the central bank's reaction function so that financial markets can efficiently process information and estimate what the central bank is likely to do in the future. So that because that the reason for that is that fundamentally what monetary policy is about is not setting that policy rate today. It's a commitment to adjusting that policy rate in the future in a way that's consistent with anchoring inflation and inflation expectations. And I don't believe the Bank of England, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, I don't believe that these advanced economies have actually gotten to the point where the Bank of Canada and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand was when they first introduced what we call flexible inflation targeting and so on. Now, back to the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, they did it much like the Bank of England is doing today. And it took several years to develop a forecasting and policy analysis system. And it wasn't until they invited me there and explained to them how to do it and how to develop a plan that they then embarked upon that plan. It took them 3 years to do it. And out of that came a little book called the Forecasting and Policy Analysis System. That's where the term forecasting and policy analysis system came from. That it wasn't just about some toolkit and some models, it was about a process where everybody understood these three essential ingredients and how important they were. So that's the thing that really distinguishes non-FPASS central banks like the Bank of England, like the ECB, and so on, from the FPASS Mark One Club. Now, the FPASS Mark One Club, we evaluated in a book just before I retired from the IMF in 2018. So this is a book published. Maury Opsfeld, Tobias Adrian, and I were editors, and it took stock of all the experiences. I think the Bank of England and I think Claire Lombardelli needs to read that book to get up to speed about where things stood in 2018. But subsequent to that, the Central Bank of Armenia asked me to develop the second generation of forecasting and policy analysis systems that dealt with uncertainty. And I think when you look at the comments of Claire, she would, I think, be well advised to read the book on the prudent risk management approach to monetary policy, because it would address many of the issues that she thinks she's facing, because they don't seem to be aware of what has actually gone on over the last 3 decades in developing FPASS Mark One and what has happened over the last few years in response to observing the stagflationary shocks related to COVID, where it's all about managing short-run trade-offs, providing obviously anchored long-term inflation expectations, and providing a framework for managing short-run conflicting objectives. The idea being that when you have stagflationary shocks that raise inflation and reduce output or raise unemployment, that puts the central bank into a more difficult situation in terms of managing expectations and so on. So I want to ask, there's another issue that's sort of related to this, and that's about how much does monetary policy cost? Currently, the Bank of England spends over 50 million pounds a year doing monetary policy, and it could be done much, much more efficiently if they recognized that this isn't just about developing a bunch of models, but actually developing a training program to invest in the human capital that's necessary to implement this prudent risk management approach to monetary policy that they seem to be interested in, but seem to be making extremely slow progress trying to develop. But Martin, do you have any reflections on that?
Well, I have a number of observations. No, first of all, looking at the table that you're displaying, I was wondering where the Federal Reserve Board would be in that table. And
that is yeah, okay, good.
I mean,
So
my guess is it would be in the left-hand column.
so that is a very, very good question, okay? Because if you actually look at what the board does, okay, in so they when you look at the work of the economists on the board of governors, they that staff present to the FOMC scenarios, and although in that analysis, that way of doing it would be completely consistent with FPASS Mark II. And so you can go back with a 5-year lag and look at all the analysis that they did, for example, during the global financial crisis and so on. What happened is that, unfortunately, under Bernanke, they came up with this crazy, pardon me, but I'm going to use the word crazy. I know you don't like me to use that word. You like me to use the word unhelpful, but they came up with this crazy dot plot thing. And the problem with the dot plot is the dot plot is like getting forecasts from each of the FOMC members, plus other people's that aren't voting members, and asking them what their forecasts are for unemployment, PCE inflation, core PC inflation, the Fed funds rate, over a short and medium term horizon, plus what they think those variables would be over the longer term. But the problem is that you can't connect the dots, so you don't know whose forecast of inflation is connected to whose forecast of unemployment and growth and stuff like that. That was definitely a step in the wrong direction. So it's a very, very good point to point out, Martin. They were like, they have all the capacity, all the tools, all the human capital, but they made, I think, a very bad decision because they felt like they wanted to include all the regional banks and give them some input into the process. I don't know why, to tell you the truth, why they needed anonymity in terms of presenting those forecasts to the rest of the world, because it just comes down to a game where people then try to sift through the minutes to try to figure out whose dot is connected to what dot and so on. So that raises a very interesting question about whether or not they should be classified as an FPASS Mark II central bank or as a non-FPASS central bank. Luckily, when Bernanke gave his report to the Bank of England, he did not recommend those dot plots. So I think he's learning from the mistakes that basically the Fed has made and so on. But his report was very ambiguous. What is a seasoned PhD? And so there's a lot of things that are that you have to read between the lines to try to figure out what the heck he was talking about. So absolutely great response, Martin. They could be an FPASS Mark II. Now, the big question is why, and I think the answer to that question, people would say, is that the Fed is a very complex institution with a very complex history. It started off as a bunch of regional Feds that were meant to, have these people that were very independently minded and so on. And I think it's so that part of the Fed is very complicated, but also they have this dual mandate where they're responsible to Congress and so on. So a lot of these issues, I think they're probably even people that know that the issues exist are afraid to bring up, uh, you know, possibly because of the current situation. Would they get a better deal with Congress than what they currently have? So, very good observation, Martin, I believe.
So then, some other observations. I mean, you talked, and the Bernanke report certainly talked about one of the problems at the Bank of England being the speed with which people change jobs, and how Bank of England staff feel they need to get broad experience in order to get promoted, or they need to change jobs in order to get promoted. This is something that has been repeatedly said, not just about the Bank of England, but also about much of the civil service in the United Kingdom. People keep saying it's going to change and it never does. So it will be interesting to see, whether things are going to be different this time or not. I suspect that the Bank of England will have every intention of trying to allow people to develop experience, long periods of experience in specific areas, but actually the staff will feel that they need breadth in order not only to get promoted in the bank, but also to add to their human capital, i.e. their earning power, when they come to leave the bank. So, whatever the intention is, it'll be interesting to see what progress is there. On the issue of what do policy instruments need to do to achieve inflation and other objectives, here there's I think the institutional situation at the Bank of England does need to be understood. The position there is that the Monetary Policy Committee votes on short-term monetary policy. Now, you've identified that policy is effective through a policy rule that tells you about, that shows implicitly or explicitly the responses of the central bank. The difficulty that the Bank of England faces is that getting the MPC to agree on a policy rule would, I think, probably be extremely difficult. And to some extent, I think they would probably put off, but they'd be put off in the light of the experience of forward guidance, which was an attempt to codify reactions, but ended up so complicated that no one understood what was going on. Separately, on the issue of what fiscal policy instruments need to do to achieve inflation and other objectives, here I don't know what the position is in other countries, but the Bank of England feels it needs to set policy taking the government's fiscal policy as a given. And again, the politics lie behind that, no one elects the members of the Monetary Policy Committee. MPs would be very likely to say, no one's elected you. What's it up to you? On how taxes are set. That's a decision for people who have been voted for and who have won elections. So I think expecting the Bank of England to comment on what needs to be done with fiscal policy to achieve inflation and other objectives is something that isn't going to happen, however desirable it might be to have a single body or some approximation to a single body which set monetary and fiscal policy, an idea that's been around for a long time, I think going back to the 1950s, but politically is a non-starter. Where one could make some progress is on the issue of, and the Bank of England has made some progress, is on the issue of scenarios. So far, they have focused on more of a response of wages to inflation or to rebuilding real wages, and then less of a response than in the central forecast. I can certainly see arguments for producing more scenarios, and in the scenarios, it would be possible to show the path of interest rates that the central bank staff thought necessary to deliver the objectives. If I turn now to the main forecast, the forecast produced by the Monetary Policy Committee, about 12 years ago, there was a lot of pressure on the bank to reveal more than just forecasts for inflation, growth, and unemployment, the three variables for which the Monetary Policy Committee is responsible. And there was a question how to do that, because the Monetary Policy Committee wouldn't be in a position to discuss the details of the forecast. The solution that was reached was for the Bank of England staff to release details, which was described as consistent with the Monetary Policy Committee's projections for inflation, growth, and unemployment. Now, one could possibly think of extending that, asking even to the core forecast, the modal outcome, by asking the bank staff to say what path of interest rates they think is necessary to achieve the outcomes that the MPC is forecasting. So it wouldn't then be the MPC that produces the path, the bank staff would produce the path, and the MPC wouldn't be responsible for what was shown, but that might be a way of providing information about, or some information about, the future, while recognizing that the Monetary Policy Committee is the body that sets the policy variable and implicitly has in mind something about where it's going to have to go in the future. So I think there is progress that can be made, but equally there are political constraints. Now, quite an interesting question would be, what does anyone think the benefits are, or what does anyone think the costs of the political constraints actually are? If monetary policy is imperfect, the cost or could be improved materially, the cost of the existing framework is much higher than just the cost of running the Bank of England. It's the cost of a suboptimal policy performance, and an attempt to quantify the social costs of the current approach relative to what could be achieved might possibly generate quite a lot of interest. So those are my thoughts on Bernanke.
Yeah. So I have a number of thoughts that I'd like to talk to you about, like going back to the very first one. So it reminds me very much about where we were in the late 1980s and the early 1990s at the Bank of Canada and so on. And what I convinced them about was that it made absolutely no sense to think about setting the policy rate today without having a macroeconomic view about what was priced into financial markets and deciding, are you trying to nudge the expected path of the policy rate, which influences longer term interest rates and the exchange rate in an open economy? Are you trying to nudge those financial conditions to be tighter or looser and so on? And so this whole idea that you vote about the policy rate without thinking through the process of what is currently priced in financial markets and how you're trying to nudge that. It makes no sense whatsoever. And so I managed to do that. Uh, that required showing them that we could construct paths for the policy rate that made sense. That the whole idea that they would have to decide on that rate made absolutely no sense. The policymakers don't have the capacity to be able to vote on things like that. So the system that we put in place basically delegated the construction of macroeconomic scenarios, including sensible paths for the expected policy path, to the staff, which was then used importantly as a frame of reference for the policymakers to discuss their points of view relative to that reference path. So I would say, the Bank of England simply just doesn't understand that basic idea, whereas the majority of central banks now that practice, FPASS Mark One, managed to overcome that. The second point, with regard to how do you get people to, how do you get competent people on the staff to be able to do that? And the answer is you need a training program, because people that come out of school would have absolutely no idea how to do something like that. So this is why, we when we invested in central banks when I was working at the IMF, it was all about finding the economists that could make the transition from academia that thought somehow the answer could come out of a model. You'd go away, build a model, and it would come out of it. I think the Bank of England suffers from that. They simply have no idea what a seasoned PhD is. A seasoned PhD is someone that could actually do that and command the respect of a monetary policy committee so that they have confidence in the process, that the staff are capable of doing something like that. And of course, that they don't fall into the trap that they somehow have to vote on a specific path that has zero probability of ever being achieved. Okay, so my response to that, to your first remark, where you say that they have to vote on that stuff, that is just, they'll never make any progress whatsoever if they carry on with that view about what their job is. Okay, their job, if they have individual accountability, is to have their own views about things. The reason that we have a monetary policy committee is that they have different views. And so the whole idea that they have to vote on one path is simply a massive misuse of resources in the institution. The other thing that we've come up with is that having designed training programs in central banks like Armenia, where they have very limited resources. So they have a budget of 3 million, not over 50 million like the Bank of England has. And when you have very few resources, I think it makes you focus more on what is important. What we've learned in terms of training staff, one very important thing that we've learned is that when I got into this business in the early 1980s, when I moved to the Bank of Canada from grad school, is we used to have specialists. And the problem with having specialists, particularly if you didn't have a framework with these three essential ingredients, is that you had enormous communication problems, enormous inefficiency. And what we've learned and what we've embodied into our training now is that when we train economists, they have to know everything. They have to understand the macroeconomics. They have to understand modeling. They have to understand current analysis. They have to understand everything to be able to create a framework. The other thing and it's very much related to this stuff, because she said one of the problems with producing scenarios is that they might might become lightning bolts or lightning rods, and actually possibly increase uncertainty. That problem has been solved as well. She should read the Central Bank of Armenia's monetary policy report, as well as their transparency report. Again, in addition to that, read the book that explains everything, documents absolutely everything. And in that monetary policy report, you're going to see alternative scenarios. So you're going to see a market reference scenario about what's currently priced in financial markets. This is not this is a consistent macroeconomic scenario that is the starting point for creating alternative scenarios that are interesting to policymakers. In the monetary policy report, we produce a case A and a case B scenario. Case A scenario is a scenario where inflationary pressures are such that the interest rate path has to be higher than what's currently priced in financial markets. So just think about how useless it is to think about one path. Over the last few weeks, because of what's been going on in financial markets, that expected path of the policy rate has been gyrating up and down in response to news. So how useful could it be to think about one specific path and to communicate that to the market? So instead, we think about different types of scenarios that would require a higher interest rate path and scenarios that would require a lower interest rate path. But in addition to that, to deal with the problem that Claire is talking about, that those paths are only used as a frame of reference for the actual policymakers to explain their own views. And in addition to that, there is a table in the report, a taxonomy of different types of scenarios that talks about all possible different uh, types of things that could happen, but it's done in a qualitative way so that it would not suffer from the problem that Claire was mentioning, that somehow mentioning this path would then result in higher uncertainty. That is a direct problem with this, pardon the expression, but this crazy assumption that somehow the policymakers have to vote on any particular path. That is the job of these seasoned PhDs that I think that Ben Bernanke is referring to, that people can read about, again with a 5-year lag, by looking at at what those seasoned economists produce at the Fed when they produce these alternative scenarios and present them to the FOMC, but unfortunately are not published without a 5-year lag. Okay, so that is responding to two things. Your second point on fiscal policy, maybe you could repeat it, and then maybe I could respond to that as well.
Yes, I mean the issue on fiscal policy is that the Bank of England, the Monetary Policy Committee, is a group of experts that no one has ever voted for. If they were to start commenting on what needed doing to the fiscal position, MPs would start to say, "Who are these people interfering with taxation?" which is
Right.
rightly the job of elected representatives. No taxation without representation.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is definitely an area where there are sensitivities. Now, obviously, if it's relevant for monetary policy, it needs to be incorporated into the analysis in some way. Okay, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the typical convention would be to say that we're basing this analysis on whatever policies are announced and so on. And you can see in the recent environment with these tariff policies that are changing every day, that is a very difficult thing that needs to be um, um, you know dealt with carefully. Um,
No, I mean, I take that point, but when you've said, using the policies that are announced, that's what what the Monetary Policy Committee actually does. And what it doesn't say, I mean, the difficulty it has is that it may not believe the policies that are announced because they can sometimes, and Liz Truss's example was only an extreme example, they can sometimes set the national debt on a path which isn't thought to be sustainable. So the I think the Monetary Policy Committee has to manage that, and it's
Yeah.
not always an easy judgment. There was, I think, one departure from that principle when it was widely thought there would be a fiscal relief scheme for high fuel prices, and the Bank of England made reference to that, even though it hadn't formally been legislated.
I think FPASS Mark II helps a little bit with that because it's not about just about producing the most likely scenario. So FPASS Mark II can incorporate the ideas of uncertainty, including uncertainty about policies and so on. So I think FPASS Mark II has a I think it can be used and actually is being used at the Central Bank of Armenia because they can talk about policy uncertainty and without putting too much emphasis on a specific baseline with a specific set of policies that obviously are changing every day. So,
Yes, well, I mean, there may be a bit more that can be said around that through the scenarios, but I'm sure, well, based on my own experience, members of the committee are worried that even if they simply showed a different path for fiscal policy from that which is implicit in government policy statements, then they'd be asked which path do you think is more likely, which path do you think is necessary, and that's something that they'd rather steer clear of. And the judgment they're making is that to preserve independence of monetary policy from political decision making, you have equally not to step into the fiscal territory.
yeah, totally, totally agree. So, did you have any comments on what I was referring to? Because you tend to take as given that somehow the Bank of England has to vote on the policy rate and they have to vote on the future path of the policy rate to make this system. And my experience was that in all these central banks, the benefits of thinking about things consistently far outweigh the problems. So you just get the policymakers out of that whole process of thinking that they have to actually forecast they have to have vote on a particular line. That's what the problem is at the Bank of, or that's one of the main problems at the Bank of England. The other problem is what does it cost 50 million pounds? Like, when we do some simple calculations and we think about implementing FPASS Mark II, the most we can get up to is 10 million pounds. Like it's impossible to spend more than 10 million pounds. Anything above 10 million pounds would just result in inefficiency. At 10 million pounds, we can hire 24 people and pay them way more than the average Bank of England staff. But we'd be hiring people that are seasoned PhDs and so on. So I think part of the problem is, and this was also mentioned in the Bernanke report, is that there's just massive inefficiency in the way things are done at the Bank of England. But like, how is it possible to spend over 50 million pounds a year on monetary policy and not, be able to replicate something close to the best of the best? That's what I'm really wondering about.
Well, I suppose the sort of unresolved question is how different things would have been with a different and with the sort of framework you're describing, independently of what it costs. And no, I certainly haven't seen any estimates of the answer to that.
Well, if one looks at long-term inflation expectations, if one looks at medium-term inflation expectations, those things let me just go back a little bit in history. In May of 1997, when the Monetary Policy Committee was first created, they moved from a range target to a point target. They created the MPC and so on, and so that they gave the Bank of England instrument independence. Within about 9 months, long-term inflation expectations, as measured by taking the difference between the rates of return on index bonds and conventional bonds, became very well anchored to the target. Okay, but I think the failure to develop this framework that we're talking about eventually caught up to them. Even before COVID, long-term inflation expectations, according to those measures, started to drift up, and during this stagflationary shocks of COVID, they drifted up even further. And this, of course, was consistent with the pricing decisions that were embodied in things like service price inflation, which obviously reflect medium-term inflation expectations and so on. So, so you're absolutely right. I mean, we won't know and have conclusive evidence about what the costs of allowing inflation expectations to ratchet upwards. But historically, allowing that to happen eventually required monetary policy to be tighter for some period of time in the future to not only bring inflation down, but to re-anchor long-term inflation expectations at the target. There's a vast amount of empirical evidence, not just about the United Kingdom, but about many, many countries about what those potential costs are. So I would say if you could spend 10 million pounds developing a state-of-the-art framework and prevent that kind of thing from happening again, the welfare consequences are dramatic and so on. So is that not consistent with your judgment about what has actually happened?
No, I mean, the observation I would make is that I think at the moment the jury's out on whether the continuing high rate of wage increase arises from real wage resistance or from an increase in inflation expectations. I mean, that's something that I'm sure will be a topic for continuing research, but certainly people with experience of the 1970s or memories of the 1970s would probably say that real wage resistance, the combination of a low level of unemployment and a history of stagnant or slightly falling real wages, is a factor independently of inflation expectations.
I think both of them play into it, though,
well,
don't
they may well do, but I don't have a sense of, or I haven't studied the data, and I'm not sure we have enough data yet to form a view on the actual consequences, the actual contribution of each of those.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so this was only the first part, and hopefully that has been useful information, and then I think we should probably call it a day, and then move on to the next part next week. Okay.
Okay. So, do you plan to meet on Monday next week, or only on Thursday? Monday next week.
Monday.
Okay. Okay, that's excellent.
Thank you, Martin.
See you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye.